Good morning, good evening, YouTube, wherever you're at. So, I recently reached 100 subscribers. I'm actually a little bit over that now, but I want to go ahead and make a video to celebrate this occasion and say thank you to everybody. I'm surprised how quickly it's happened. I've only been on YouTube for about 2 months now, and it just came pretty quick. I got tagged in a video by Joseph Francis Burton, so check out his video if you haven't seen any of his stuff yet. That's Joseph Francis Burton. It was really nice of him to tag me in that video. But anyway, so just to kind of celebrate my 100 subscribers, I'm going to do my reading journey. But first, I want to do a little bit of show and tell. So I recently picked this up. This is the historical maps of the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, I closed it, but I had a great map opened of the war near Salamanca in Spain. But I love history, I love historical fiction, and by extension, I love maps. And I just love stuff like this. There's a lot of great stuff in this book. I'm going to do a book haul. That's Castile right there, showing a fort. Anyway, so I thought I'd show this. Kind of a bit of a coffee table book, not real big, kind of meant for reference, but this is the kind of stuff I like when I read historical fiction. I'll talk a little bit about my reading here at the end, but I'm currently rereading the Sharpe novels by Bernard Cornwell. I'm going to reread Bernard Cornwell's entire catalog. So I kind of picked this up for more reference material. And I just like stuff like this a lot. So anyway, so to celebrate my 100 subscribers, I was going to talk a bit about my reading journey and my reading, sort of my personal canon. I've talked about this a little bit before. So for me, my grandma was an English teacher, so she always encouraged me to read, and not just encouraged, but oftentimes made it mandatory. And I didn't always appreciate it at the time, but now that I look back on it, I'm really grateful that she did. And kind of, a little bit of wisdom. That's the hard part about being a parent, right? Is doing those things, making your kids do things that don't make them happy, right? Even though you may, in your heart, want to make them happy all the time, it's not always what's best for them. So anyway, so I'm just really grateful for that. So the very first stuff I was really reading on my own, like I chose to read it, was comic books. I always preferred DC comics. So I grew up at my grandma and grandpa's house. There were lots of comic books already there that belonged to my dad and my uncles. And they were really into like the new Teen Titans and Superman and a bunch of DC characters, Batman, Legion of Superheroes. They liked Marvel too, though, so they had some Daredevil, and there's some bunch of Frank Miller Daredevils, some stuff like that. But anyway, so I kind of just came up. So just kind of by extension, it being in my proximity, I gravitated towards DC Comics. But that was like my first, this is what I want to read. And my grandma would give me so many subscriptions a month, because way back you could get comic books mailed to you every month because they were they're periodical, so you could get them monthly. Eventually, I would go to my LCS, my local comic shop, but and I would continue reading comics on and off throughout up until I was even in high school. And out of high school, I stopped for some years and then came back to it. But yeah, my big ones were I really liked Green Lantern a lot, Green Lantern, Nightwing. I liked all the characters that didn't have crossovers all the time, so I really liked the Flash a lot. The Flash is one of my favorite characters in comics. So. I remember I really like Thor a lot for Marvel. Really like the Dan Jurgens Thor run. If you're interested in comics, check that out. It's a good run. But anyway, but I remember being at my grandma's house, and she was like really kind of pushing the reading thing. And I remember my uncle. I used to play chess with my uncle all the time. He's a bit of an intellectual. Anyway, so I remember playing chess with him. I was really young at the time. I remember him saying, she's gonna make talking about my grandma. She's gonna make you read, so you might as well just pick something you like. He's like, here, let me show you these books, and he got a box of his stuff out, and he had a handful sitting there on top, and he kind of showed me a few, and then then he left the room or whatever, and I picked one up, and it was Tarzan of the Apes, by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I was like, oh, I'll read this. This looks kind of interesting. So I just started thumbing through it, and then I started it. I was like, well, this looks good, so I read it, and I loved it. It was a great book. But anyway, so I really love that Tarzan of the Apes. The next one I would pick out of there. Well, I think I read the second Tarzan book right after that. But then I read The Three Musketeers. And I absolutely love The Three Musketeers. It's one of my favorite books ever. Tarzan of the Apes is too, but I love The Three Musketeers. Tarzan of the Apes instilled an interest in me in Africa for the rest of my life. To this day, I find Africa just fascinating. The history of Africa, its geography, it's just everything about it. It's biodiversity. Everything about Africa is just absolutely fascinating to me. I just love books set in Africa, histories of Africa. It's one of the reasons I gravitated towards Wilbur Smith. So just a little bit about me. Bernard Cornwell and Wilbur Smith are my two favorite authors. They've been my favorite authors for years and years now. But anyway, so I would still go throughout high school at that point, and I would read on and off. I remember probably the next book I really got into that I really liked was Of Mice and Men. I've kind of mentioned this before. We had to pick a book out, and the way it worked when I was in school, there was this thing called Accelerated Reader. You had to take these AR tests. So, and you read a book. You could pick whatever book you wanted. You go through, it was on the computer. You pick it out. You do a test. And the one I picked up, Of Mice and Men, because it was literally the smallest book on the shelf. So I picked it up. I read it, and I loved it. And to this day, I love Of Mice and Men. I will buy multiple copies of that book because you can get it for so cheap sometimes, especially at used bookstores, and I'll just hand them out to people because it's small enough that people will give it a try. So anyway, this AR test, this AR reading, it was Accelerated Reader, is what this stuff, what the acronym stands for. I quickly discovered that. So there were points based on the size of the book. So I didn't get that many points for Of Mice and Men. So the bigger the book, though, the more points you would get for it, and the quicker you could be done with it for the quarter. So just me being the scheming, child that I was, I saw that I was looking through the list of books on this big, huge, it's a gigantic list, and Jurassic Park was worth a whole bunch of points. I was like, well, I like that movie. I love Jurassic Park. And I think that was the next book I read was Jurassic Park. And I remember really, really loving that book a lot too. But anyway, so, going through the rest of my high school though, I wasn't that into, literature and stuff yet. I would read just for pleasure here and there. It really wouldn't be till I got out of high school that I really got more into reading. I went to college, but I did, I majored in sciences. I was really more into making things and engineering and just science in general and math. I kind of gravitated more towards that at that time. If I could go back now, I think I would have done more of an arts major, but you don't really know yourself that well when you're that young. But anyway, so that's just not what I did. Like I said, I did more. I majored in computer networking, so that's what I did in school. I still work in tech, although not specifically in that, but anyway, so it doesn't matter. Going fast forward, I would eventually pick up these William Johnstone Westerns there were some of them at my grandma's house, and I started reading these William Johnstone Westerns, a whole bunch of them. I must have read 40 books by William Johnstone, maybe more than that. He has two main series. One's The Mountain Man, and the other one's like The Last Gunfighter, both of whom they're generational, they're related to each other. Smoke Jensen's the gunfighter character, and I don't remember the first name of the Mountain Man, but his last name is Jensen. Anyway, I found a couple of his books recently. I'm going to read for the next Western reading event on YouTube, or maybe for Garb August or something. But anyway, so I'd read William Johnstone. Then I read a bunch of Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour. Louis L'Amour's great. So I was still a very young man at the time, and I read all these Westerns, and I was getting burnt out on them. And I was at the library, and I was getting interested in history at this time, just of my own accord. I think I might even been out of college by this point. And I started to get really into history, because that's the way it works. Once you're out of school, you realize you actually liked all the stuff you learned in school. But anyway, so somebody I asked him about the Napoleonic Wars and what I should read, and that's kind of what got me towards I was pointing in the direction of the Sharpe novels, but also War and Peace. So that stuff would come really soon for me at that point. So the Sharpe novels by Bernard Cornwell, I started reading, and I just ate them up. Faster and even more so than I did the Westerns. I mean, I must have read 15 of them in a row. And then I read War and Peace, and of course War and Peace to this day is my favorite book. I'm going to reread War and Peace sometime. I read it again about 2 years ago. Maybe it was 3. But I want to make a video about it. I want it to be more fresh in my memory when I do. So I plan on reread of it soon. I'll talk a little bit more at the end about what's coming up for me and what I plan on doing. But anyway, so I got really into Bernard Cornwell. So I read a bunch of these Sharpe novels. They weren't all out at the time. This is 2010, 2011, something like that. So I started reading some of his other stuff, like The Last Kingdom was out at the time, so I started reading that. There was 2 other authors I would get into at that time. There was Michael Crichton, because remember I read Jurassic Park, so I knew that author's name. So, and then the other one I would get into is James Michener, which I picked up off the shelf because it said Alaska, and I was interested in Alaska. I like geography too, and I remember picking that up and reading that book, and I remember really liking that. And then I read Texas, James Michener's Texas, because I thought that would have a Western element to it, so I read that. Then I read a bunch of other books that were based on movies. Like I read The Godfather, and I thought that book sucked. It's not nearly as good as the movie, but a couple other ones like that. But anyway, so this would go on for years. I just read casually. You know what I mean? I wasn't just, I probably read a lot more than most Americans, but I was probably reading 30, 40 books a year. But not like I wasn't just reading constantly all the time, every minute I had. At least not as much as I do now, where I read quite a bit. Now, in my day-to-day life now, during the summers and even in the spring, I do a lot of work in my house and stuff, so I don't get to read as much then. But, during the winter and the fall, I read quite a bit. So I've had a really good quarter reading this year. And even during that time, I read all year round, but it's just a little bit slower for me at that time. So anyway, so I was still a pretty young man. I'm reading all this Bernard Cornwell and all this historical fiction. I would get into a few other authors. I started reading a bunch of Con Ingledon, and there's a few others. I read some Robert Lowe, just a bunch of historical fiction stuff. I read a bunch of James Michener. I really like James Michener a lot. So anyway, Rutherford, I really liked his stuff a lot. I want to read Ruska by Rutherford. I haven't got to that yet, but I read his London book. I also read a lot of nonfiction. I like Christian Walmart a lot. He writes these books related to trains, but you might think you hear trains and it sounds boring, but it's really fascinating the way trains affect history. So they were a really key component in human history. But anyway, I would then have this spurt of like 3 years where I wanted to be a lit bro. By this time, this was still kind of early YouTube days, so this was probably around like 2012 or something like that. And I spent just 3 years reading nothing but like classic literature and Western canon stuff. And I did this for, like I said, years. That's why I was trying to read a bunch of Faulkner and Cormac McCarthy, two authors I really don't like at all. I don't plan on revisiting them ever. But I read a whole bunch of other stuff. That's I think that's when I finally read. I read a bunch of John Steinbeck and Ernest Hemingway, and I read the Iliad, just a whole bunch of stuff, man. I had already read War and Peace at that time, but I read like a bunch of Jane Austen. I read, Wuthering Heights, just all kinds of stuff. The Catcher in the Rye, and just The Great Gatsby, and a bunch of Jack London, and just anything that was considered classic literature. I just read a whole bunch of. I could have got a list up and shown you guys and stuff. Picture of Dorian Gray, Dostoevsky. I read, the Brothers Karamazov, and Crime and Punishment, which I know a lot of people like the Brothers Karamazov more, but I think I like Crime and Punishment a little bit more personally. That's just my personal taste. But anyway, so I just read a whole bunch of classic literature, and this would, like I said, this would go on, like I said, for 2-3 years. And it was good for me. I learned a lot from it. But I was just, because I was trying to be part of that Lit Bro Club. I remember reading 266 by Roberto Bolaño. I read that book twice, actually. That's kind of a tough read. I really liked it the first time, but I don't know if that was me trying to be pretentious and just say, like, oh, I read 266 and I love it. It's fantastic. I read it the second time, and I remember still liking it, but just not as much as I did the first time. I don't know. But I read some of his other, I read like Savage Detectives. And I just read a whole bunch of, a whole bunch of, literature and classic literature and stuff. And modern literature too. So like I tried reading, which is like that 266 or Infinite Jest. I didn't like Infinite Jest, but I read it. Anyway, so. And then just since then, eventually I would just kind of go back to, more my typical reading taste, which is just more historical fiction and stuff. I think at that time, because I didn't, I developed an interest in more pulp fiction stuff too. So I was familiar with Conan. So I remember going back and reading a bunch of other Robert E. Howard stuff and his other Conan. I was introduced to Conan through the Robert Jordan books, so those were the first ones I read. And then I would find some of the Spragny Camp books, and I read some of those. And I think the Conan movie novelization is by Spragny Camp. I might be wrong, but I remember reading that. Maybe that was my first Conan book, actually. I think it was. Now I think about it. But then I remember having some Robert Jordan ones too, so they must have been both at my grandma's house. But anyway, but then I'd go read a bunch of Robert E. Howard, and then I read a bunch of H.P. Lovecraft, and then that's when I got really into kind of that pulp fiction era, and I read some Clark Ashton Smith, and I read some Dashiell Hammett. I do want to revisit some more of that pulp era fiction stuff. I just find the pulp era fiction just fascinating. It is so fascinating to me that they used to publish these magazines that, you know, that were black and white print that people would go out and buy and read for fun, for pleasure. It just boggles my mind that people did that. But anyway, so, and then eventually, like I said, I've just come back around the last couple of years. I just want to read for fun and for pleasure. That's why I read. You know, it's not going to change my life. I know people put all these books, change your life and all this stuff, but you know, that's just kind of I don't know. Books just don't really do that, right? You can learn a lot from a book. I remember I had a whole spurt too when I read a bunch of self-help books. You know, and I learned stuff from them, but that's just not going to change your life. Reading's good for you. I think that's true. Anyway, so that's a bit of my reading journey. So now I just read what I like. You know, I still read classic literature and stuff, but it just has to be something I'm interested in. I'm not going to force myself to read books to be part of some lit bro club, right? Like I'm just going to read stuff I enjoy personally. That's just what I like. That's what I like to do, and that tends to be historical fiction and nonfiction. And that's what I like now. If I'm reading historical fiction, I'm referring to the actual history. I want to learn about it. I want to know more about it. I'm kind of working on writing a book myself, which is going to take place during, you know, the first Duke of Marlborough, which is John Churchill. So my idea is it's kind of like the Bernard Cornwell Sharpe novels, except it's going to take place during sort of kind of like the way the Duke of Wellington is in the Sharpe novels. Mine's going to be like more like the Duke of Marlborough. And, you know, which is John Churchill, and, you know, have a character kind of follow through his campaigns, which is a whole lot of stuff, right? While his main thing was the War of Spanish Succession, he was, you know, there was a whole bunch of other things, the William, and, you know, the Jacobites and the Williamites and the Monmouth Rebellion and just all kinds of the 9 Years' War. He was, all involved in all this stuff. The dude just had an amazing life. But I'm going to read that Winston Churchill biography of him soon. I just need to read that, and I'm going to do some more research on him. But I have an idea of kind of writing something in that time period. So, will it be any good? I don't know. It'd be fun to do, though. So, anyway, so that's all for today, YouTube. I hope that was interesting. Again, thank you for 100 subscribers. Yeah, I'll come back. I'll do a reading update next time. Good night or good day, wherever you're at.